Hey guys, just me, Mr. Plazik. What this video series is going to do is for HBS, and basically what it's going to do is going to help prepare you for the test that you have coming up over 1.2 and 1.3. 1.2 was identity tissues, and 1.3 that we talked a little bit about was dealing with identity molecules and cells. Remember in 1.2 we analyzed the different tissue types. We did a little bit of a flow chart, and then we went into an analyzation of the skeletal system and identifying bones. From there we were able to identify key features on these bones and determine the sex of an individual, the ethnicity of the individual, the age of the individual, the height of the individual based upon these bones. Then we moved on to 1.3, in which we analyzed the DNA from the individual's bones themselves and use these things called restriction enzymes. So this video series is just going to help you prepare for this test that you have coming up over 1.2 and 1.3. So let's get started. So the first thing that we're going to do, guys, is we're going to talk a little bit about the four major tissue types that we have. We have epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, and then we have nervous tissue. This picture here that you're looking at is epithelial tissue. And epithelial tissue is going to cover and line things is what it's going to do. It's going to protect. It's this major purpose that it has. So when we take a look at the outside of our skin, that is epithelial tissue. If we were to open up our body cavities, the inside of our body cavities are going to be lined with epithelial tissue. If we were to take a look at the inside of an artery or the inside of a vein, it's going to be lined with epithelial tissue. Also, epithelial tissue is a major constituent of glandular tissue as well. We have two types of glands. We have endocrine glands and exocrine glands. We'll talk a little bit about these glands in more detail once we move on to the unit that we call communication. We'll deal with these types of glands when we talk a little bit about the endocrine system. But some of the key characteristics when I look at epithelial tissue is that the cells are all tightly joined together. So when I look at this diagram here, I can see there's a cell here, and there's a cell right beside it. So when I look at epithelial tissue, these cells are tightly joined together. And that's good for protection purposes, so things can't get through it relatively easy. In the cases of the inside of our mouth or on the surface of our skin or the inside of our esophagus, it makes it very tough type of tissue when you analyze it that particular way. But the key characteristics of epithelial tissue is these cells are all tightly joined together. There's no space in between the cells themselves. So they kind of act like a brick wall when we take a look at epithelial tissue. So the next type of tissue that we have is called connective tissue. And connective tissue is kind of a hodgepodge of a whole bit different types of tissues that are in here. You have something called areolar tissue. You have blood that falls in here. You have bone that falls in here. You have tendons. You have ligaments. You have fat that all falls into this particular category that we call connective tissue. Interesting thing that connective tissue does is connective tissue helps join things together. So it brings one tissue type together with another tissue type. It's called a packing type of tissue. Also, connective tissue serves a protective function as well. When we take a look at bone and the protective properties of bone, protecting things like our brain and nervous tissue, protecting some of our key organs that we have. Also, when we take a look at blood, blood has protective properties of it too. When it clots, it helps prevent bacterium and other harmful things from getting inside those particular areas as well. So connective tissue has a variety of functions. We look at tendons and ligaments. They help join bone to bone, help join muscle to bone as well. But some of the key characteristics when we take a look at connective tissue, basically the cells are more spread apart, and in between the cells we have something called an extracellular matrix. This type of connective tissue that you're looking at here is called areolar tissue, and you can see here's the cell here. There's a cell here. There's a cell here. Okay, but all these things are cells that are here, but these cells are in an area that's non-living matrix that we call the extracellular matrix. So all this space in between here is all the extracellular matrix. And the extracellular matrix consists of two things. It consists of a ground substance, which is a watery like matrix with polysaccharides, and then it also consists of fibers. There's different fibers that are embedded in this extracellular matrix. Things like elastic fibers, collagen, and reticular fibers are the three major fiber types that we find when we take a look at this connective tissue. This areolar tissue, you can see these are the fibers that are here that we see. But the cells are more spread out when I look at this connective tissue, and there's space in between the cells. That space in between the cells is where we find the extracellular matrix, is what we have with connective tissue. So some of the key ideas with connective tissue: cells more spread out. The matrix in between them is a non-living matrix to be called the extracellular matrix, and it consists of a ground substance, and it also consists of fibers as well. These are some more pictures that I'm going to show you of some other types of connective tissue that we have. You can see this is fat. This is adipose tissue that we have, but this is a fat cell that's right here. And you can see basically this is a cell that's been loaded up with a whole bunch of triglycerides, and the nuclei kick towards the outside of the cell. And then right here is the extracellular matrix of the actual fat itself. Fat itself is going to cushion, protect, also serves as energy storage. This right here is bone tissue that we have here. And you can see these are the spaces, the open areas that we have right here of the bone. But the bone, the extracellular matrix, when we take a look at it, it's very hard and very dense. We take a look at the matrix of bone. I wouldn't say it's much dense. There is space in between the actual bone itself. So it does have some open areas that we take a look at. But this kind of a wide variety of tissue types that we have. I mean, a wide variety of different things that we have when we take a look at the connective tissue itself. This is a dense connective tissue that you're taking a look at. So this would be like a tendon or a ligament that you're looking at. And you can see these are all the fibers right here. Here's all the fibers that are in pink. Here's the cells that are sitting right here. We're taking a look at that. This is blood right here. That's another connective tissue. Here's your red blood cells that you have here. The extracellular matrix of blood is called plasma. So the extracellular matrix of blood is called plasma. You can't see the fibers in this particular diagram in the extracellular matrix. The fibers don't become visible until the blood begins to clot, is when you see the fibers, but there are fibers that are located within the blood. These are white blood cells that are here. These giant purple things are white blood cells that we find in this particular type of connective tissue. So the next type of tissue that we have is muscular tissue, and muscle tissue has the ability to contract. And when we say contraction, basically what's happening with muscle tissue when it contracts is it gets shorter. So it moves in an inward-like fashion, and these muscle fibers get shorter. When they get shorter, they're going to pull on something, and they're going to move something is what they're going to do. There's three major types of muscle tissue that we have. We have skeletal muscle, we have smooth muscle, and we have cardiac muscle. We'll talk a little bit more about these in detail once we get into Unit 4, which is dealing with movement, is when we'll really stress these different muscle types that we have and their functions and what they look like. But muscle tissue is a fourth type of tissue, and basically muscle tissue has the ability to contract. And we find like skeletal muscle, we find attached to bones. It's going to move bones. We find cardiac muscle inside the walls of a heart, and it's going to cause the heart to be able to contract and to move blood. We find smooth muscle in the walls of every hollow organ with the exception of the heart. So like in the walls of your bladder, the walls of your esophagus, the walls of your stomach is where we find smooth muscle, and it's going to churn substances and move substances around, things like food, urine, that type of stuff as well is what it's going to move around when it contracts and it gets shorter. So some of the key things with muscle tissue is it has the ability to contract. That's its key stat. And when it contracts, it gets shorter. When it gets shorter, it helps move things or propel things around the human body. And then the final tissue that we have is nervous tissue. When we move on to Unit 2, communication, we'll talk a lot about nervous tissue. But nervous tissue has the ability to generate electrical impulses. It's a very important type of tissue that you have in your body. It consists of neurons. So all these giant purple things, these really long purple things that are right here. So here's a neuron that you're looking at right here. Here's this appendages that we have that we call axons and dendrites that are coming off of the neuron that's here. There's a nuclei that's in the center here. But this is a neuron that you're looking at right here in this nervous tissue, and basically this neuron has the ability to generate electrical impulses and communicate with surrounding tissue. It's either going to, if it fires into muscle, it's going to cause a muscle to contract. If it fires into a gland, it's going to cause a gland to release things. So this is a very important type of tissue. These cells that surround the actual neuron itself are called neuroglial cells. basically they protect the neuron itself, because the neuron is a very important cell of your body, and that it's the only cell in your body that can generate this electrical impulse. And the downfall of a neuron, though, is once it reaches its adult form, it can no longer undergo cell division. So we have to make sure that we protect this cell, and that's why you have all these other little cells that kind of surround the actual neuron itself, to make sure that the neuron is getting the nourishment that it needs, it's well protected, and those different types of things. So this is nervous tissue. It has the ability to generate electrical impulse. So after we got done, guys, analyzing and talking about those tissues, we then moved into an activity that we called bone detectives. But prior to that, guys, we added the actual face to the mannequin, and we analyzed the different types of tissue, and we kind of put them all together. We took the actual eye and we built it. We put adipose tissue behind there. We put the eye on there. We put some muscle with the orbicularis oculi. We added some skeletal muscle with the temporalis muscle that's right here. We also put the mouth on the mannequin as well. We put the eyelid on there representing the epithelial tissue. But from there, we did skeletal scavenger hunt. And with skeletal scavenger hunt, what we did was we began to analyze bones and identify bones of the human body. So what I'm going to talk about next is these bones of the human body and kind of how we name them. This is kind of the bulk of the test, is going to be identifying these bones, naming these bones, being able to tell the difference between a male and a female by looking at the bones. If you analyze the time that we put in, we put a ton of time into this whole entire mannequin activity, and then the analyzation of the missing persons with bone detectives. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the bones now. So the first thing we're going to do is kind of talk a little bit about what are the major functions of the skeletal system. When we talked a little bit about, guys, when we did 1.1, some of you guys had the skeletal system. You identified some amazing facts, and what we found out about the skeletal system is the skeletal system is the major organ system that's going to support the body. It's going to protect soft organs. When we think about the brain, we think about your heart, we think about your lungs and things like that, how that bone's helping to protect that soft tissue itself. It's also going to allow for movement due to the attachment of skeletal muscles that are going to attach to bone. It doesn't produce movement, but allows for movement because it gives the muscles something to attach onto. Also a storage area for minerals and fats. When we look at bone, calcium and phosphorus are stored in them. And then also when we take a look inside a bone, there's also fat that's stored in there as well. Also, the skeletal system is going to be the site of hematopoiesis, and hematopoiesis is the red blood cell formation. And you guys remember this from 1.1. Take a look at parts of the skeletal system that we have. So we look at the skeletal system, we're looking at the bones, the joints, the cartilages, the ligaments. Remember, ligaments attach bone to bone. But one of the things that we addressed when we took a look at skeletal scavenger hunt was the difference between the axial and the appendicular skeleton. And we take a look at the axial skeleton, which I'm going to show you here. The axial skeleton is basically what we have with it when we take a look at the axial skeleton is basically, if I draw a line longitudinally down throughout the body, right here, these bones, okay, are part of the axial skeleton. So when I look at the axial skeleton, I'm talking about the skull, I'm talking about the vertebral column, and I'm talking about the thoracic cavity as well, or the actual rib cage itself. I shouldn't say thoracic cavity, but the rib cage itself is what I'm going to talk about. So we're going to talk a little bit about the skull, we're going to talk about the sternum, the ribs, we're going to talk about the vertebral column, including the sacrum and the coccyx. These are parts of the axial skeleton. The appendicular skeleton is dealing with your appendages, is what the appendicular skeleton is dealing with. So it's dealing with your arms and legs, and then it also includes your actual coxal bone itself right here as part of the appendicular skeleton. So the appendicular skeleton is your appendages, is basically what it is. I will ask you on your test, guys, you'll have like a multiple choice question. I'll ask you, which of the following is not part of the axial skeleton? Remember, the clavicle is not part of the axial skeleton. The clavicle is part of the appendicular skeleton when we take a look at it. So we have axial and we have appendicular skeleton. Those are two key things that you have to know, and you have to know what bones are associated with what. We're going to talk a little bit about, guys, the axial skeleton is what we're going to talk about first here, and we're going to delve in by looking at the skull first. So the skull consists of two sets of bones. You have the cranial bones and then you have the facial bones, and we take a look at them. The bones are joined together by what we call sutures. I'll show you these sutures here in a little bit as to what they are and what they look like. One of the key things to know is that the mandible is the only movable bone on the skull. And we say freely movable because it moves relatively freely when we take a look at it. So when I take a look at the skull itself, some of the key bones that we had to identify was the very first thing that we did is we came in and we put a muscle here. We put a muscle right here is where we did this temporalis muscle. And the bone that's here is called the temporal bone. So this is the temporal bone. I'll mark it with a T. That's your temporal bone that's sitting right there. This bone that's right up here is called your frontal bone. So this is your frontal bone. I'll mark this with an F. And then you have a parietal bone. You have two parietal bones on either side, but this is the parietal bone that's right here. And I'll mark that with a P for parietal. And then you have another bone that's sitting back here that's called the occipital bone. And I mark that with an O. So you have a frontal bone, two parietal bones, two temporal bones, and an occipital bone. These are the bones that we identified in the skeletal scavenger hunt of the skull. And you note that these bones are held together by what we call sutures. I'm going to show you a little bit about what sutures are and what they look like. I'm going to grab a human skull, and we'll take a look at the human skull to analyze these particular sutures themselves. But this is a human skull that you're looking at right here, okay, that you can see. And if I turn here and look at the side, I can see these kind of lines that are right here. So if I look right here, I can see this is a line. Okay, this is the temporal bone that's right here. I'm taking a look at, but these are sutures, and sutures are basically how the joints of the actual bones of the skull, they kind of fit together. Kind of think of it like as a puzzle piece. So it kind of comes together like a puzzle piece. Something like this is kind of how they come together. But I can see right up here, guys, this is the frontal bone that's right here, and I can see there's a suture that's running across here. But if I look real closely at it, guys, I can kind of see how they come together. They're kind of like a puzzle is how these actual joints come together. There's your temporal. I'm going to move towards the back of the skull, and we'll see the occipital sutures that are there that I kind of drew in there that you can kind of see. But those are the actual sutures of the skull. And what you kind of have to know about these sutures is that when I take a look at a baby skull, is that they haven't fully formed. These sutures haven't fully formed yet, so the bones are more spread out, and they have what's called a soft spot. And this soft spot's going to allow the actual baby to fit through the birth canal. It's also going to give time for the brain to be able to develop and things like that. So when you look at a baby skull, which I'll show you here in just a second, when I look at a baby skull, these sutures haven't fully formed yet in joining these bones. So here I have a baby skull. This is just a model of a baby skull. It's not a real baby skull. But you can see, guys, that when you take a look at a baby skull, these sutures haven't fully formed yet. These are what we call fontanelles. We also call them soft spots, and it's going to allow the actual skull to give a little bit when we take a look at it. So that's kind of a difference between an adult skull and a baby skull. After about 24 months, these do fuse together as far as these soft spots are concerned. So this is just talking about that fetal skull that we talked about. The fetal skull is large compared to the infant. We take a look at it. It's large compared to the infant's total body length. Fetal skull is about a quarter of the body length compared to adult skull, which is about 1/8 of the body's length. These are these fontanelles. These are these fibrous membranes connecting the cranial bones together. They're also called soft spots. They allow the skull to compress during birth to fit through the birth canal. Also allow the brain to grow. These convert to bone within 24 months after birth. So when we take a look at bones of the face that we have to know, this bone right here is the only movable bone of the whole entire skull. And this is the mandible. Then you have a bone that's sitting right here. That's called your maxilla, or maxillary bones. That's right here. I'll put MA for mandible here. That's the mandible. This is their maxillary bones. That's right here. You have two of those on either side. Right up here you have a nasal bone that's hanging out right here. So this is your nasal bone that's right here. So this is your nasal bone that's right there. So we have the mandible, we have the maxilla, and we have the nasal bone that's right here, and then right here that forms your cheek. If you remember in the activity, guys, we put a piece of adipose tissue underneath this area to help form cheek fat. We put adipose tissue right here is where we added it on our mannequin. But this is called your zygomatic bone that's hanging out there. That's forming your actual cheek itself is what it's actually forming. It also has a union with the temporal bone right here is where it unites with it. But this is your zygomatic bone that we're taking a look at there. So those are some of your facial bones that you have to know for the test. There is one kind of oddball bone that's called the hyoid bone. It doesn't articulate with any other bone of the human body. It's hanging out underneath your neck right here. It serves as a point of attachment for your tongue is what it serves as. And this hyoid bone gets fractured. If you guys are into like CSI and things like that, I find a fractured hyoid bone. A lot of times that's a case that an individual has been strangled or has been involved in some type of an assault a lot of times, because that grabbing of the neck and squeezing it can actually fracture the hyoid bone. It's one bone a lot of people don't know about, but that's hanging out right underneath here, and it basically serves as an attachment for the actual tongue itself. It's going to aid in swallowing and your speech production as well, but that's called the hyoid bone. A lot of kids on the test will miss this bone, they forget about it, so don't forget about the hyoid bone. When these bones of the skull come together, basically they have areas where they unite that they produce hollow cavities. These hollow cavities within bone are what we call sinuses. And what sinuses do is they lighten the skull. They give resonance and amplification to your voice, so they allow for voice production to occur, so you have that voice that projects. And it's also an area where mucus production occurs as well. So mucus production also occurs here. I forgot to put this on the slide. So mucus production, O-U-S. Don't forget the mucus production. As well is one of the things that's occurring in these paranasal sinuses that we take a look at. And what I mean by these paranasal sinuses, these are the major paranasal sinuses that you have. These are these hollow cavities that are within bone. And when I take a look at them, basically they have a tube that's going to drain into the nasal cavity. So as they produce this mucus, they drain this mucus into the nasal cavity. And basically, if you look inside the nasal cavity, you have a group of cells that basically have these cilia that hang out on them. But then they're coated with this mucus that was produced by the paranasal sinuses. This mucus is going to trap harmful dirt, debris, might also attack viruses or things like that, might get trapped in that particular mucus itself that you can see. But sometimes during a sinus infection, what happens is you have inflammation. You have an inflammation response. This could be an allergy as well, like an allergy or allergic to pollen or something. And what happens is you have an inflammation response. When you have this inflammation response, it kind of clogs up these tubules because it inflames these tubules as well. And now this mucus can't drain, so this mucus builds up in these sinuses itself. So you have to take something called an antihistamine a lot of times. These antihistamines will reduce this swelling to open up these passageways so you can have this drainage of this mucus back into your nasal cavity, so it can trap debris and harmful particles, things like bacterium, viruses, and stuff like that. So that's kind of the point of sinuses that we have in bones. I know this time of year during the beginning of fall, we're going to have the actual allergies that are going to come into play, and you kind of wonder what an allergy actually is. So we're going to take a look at now is the vertebral column. This is another part of the axial skeleton. When we take a look at the vertebral column, basically there's 24 single vertebral bones. And when you take a look at the vertebral column, they're separated by these what we call intervertebral discs. So you basically have a vertebrae, and then you have a disc of cartilages right here. It's called fibrocartilage. Then you have another vertebrae, and then you have some more fibrocartilage that is there. Remember the numbering system when we take a look at the vertebral column. So we have 7 cervical vertebrae, we have 12 thoracic vertebrae, and we have 5 lumbar vertebrae. If you can remember that 7, 12, 5. In class, remember when we did the bone detectives, we talked a little bit about eating breakfast at 7 o'clock, eating lunch at 12 o'clock, and then eating dinner at 5 o'clock. So 7, 12, 5 are the key numbers to remember. We take a look at the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae. So when we take a look at the vertebrae themselves, I was talking a little about this cushioning that's in between here. So this is a vertebrae that's right here, and right here is where you're going to find if I can do this right. Right here is where you're going to find that cartilage that's right here. And then the other vertebrate's going to attach right directly onto that. But there is this cartilage that's in between each vertebrae when we take a look at them. And that's going to be like the cushion, the individual and things like that is what it's going to do. It's going to help cushion absorb shock and stuff like that. When I look at the sacrum and the coccyx, they don't have this cartilage in between him. Basically, the vertebrae are completely fused together when I look at the sacrum and the coccyx. So when I look at the sacrum and the coccyx, 9 vertebrae fuse together to form the sacrum and the coccyx, 5 fuse together to form the sacrum, and 4 fuse together to form the coccyx. So this is your vertebral column that we take a look at right here. And you can see that this is your cervical vertebrae that are right here. C1 through C7 is your cervical vertebrae. The C1 vertebrae is called the atlas, and the C2 has a specific name that's called the axis. So you have the atlas, and then you have the axis as well. Then you have the T1 to T12. These are called your thoracic vertebrae. Oops, I went a little further right there. Right there is your thoracic vertebrae. Are these ones right here? Your thoracic vertebrae have ribs that are associated with them. So ribs number 1 through 12 are going to touch these thoracic vertebrae or articulate with these thoracic vertebrae. And then moving down, we have the L1 to L5, which are your lumbar vertebrae. And then we have your sacrum. And then we have your coccyx. If we take a look at the actual natural shape of the actual spinal column in an adult, it's an S shape. So the spinal column in an adult has an S shape. And this allows us to be bipedal. When we're a baby, it has a C-shaped spine. So when we're born, we have a C-shaped spine. And then as we grow and develop, it turns into this S-shaped spine is what we basically have. This allows us to be bipedal. This is one of the reasons that babies can't walk upright is because their spine is C-shaped, and then over time it becomes S-shaped and allows them to become bipedal. So this is dealing with that primary curvature. This is present from birth. It's a C-shaped spine that we have. And then the secondary curvature develops later on as you begin to age and you begin to develop after birth. And this allows us to have this S-shaped spine, which makes us bipedal. You can see in this baby, this is that nice C-shaped spine that they have. There are some disorders that we can have of the spinal column and causing it to get out of alignment. Some of these are genetic based, whereas these are a result of your lifestyle and your posture and things like that, or putting on weight. This first one that we have is scoliosis. And scoliosis is a misalignment where your vertebral column goes more towards the lateral side of the body and doesn't stay as medial. The way that I can tell a person has scoliosis is if I look at the scapula. One scapula appears to be higher than another. The second disorder we have is called kyphosis, and kyphosis can be a result of having poor posture. They also call this having hunchback. This third one's called lordosis, and having excess weight in the abdominal region causes you to have this sway back. These all cause a lot of pain in the individual that has these particular spinal column difficulties or problems. Right here is your kyphosis. This is that hunchback that we have. This is scoliosis. When you take a look at scoliosis, notice that the S-ing of the spine, the out of alignment that we have of the vertebral column. And then this is lordosis that you have here. This person has excess weight in their abdominal region. And then they have this hollow portion right here that is going inward in that particular individual's spinal column itself. So those are 3 fairly common vertebral problems that you see as a chiropractor. We talked a little bit about the sacrum and the coccyx. The coccyx is also called your tailbone. Remember, these are vertebrae that are fused together. So here's your sacrum, and then here's your coccyx that we have. Then we take a look at the bony thorax, which consists of your sternum and your ribs. We have these things called true ribs, false ribs, and floating ribs. So when I take a look at the sternum itself, so the sternum itself is divided into 3 parts. This part right here is called your manubrium. So right here is your manubrium. So this is your manubrium that's right here. This is your body. So this part right here is your body. And then this part right here is your xiphoid process. So you have your manubrium, your body, and your xiphoid process. Those are the 3 parts of the sternum that you have to know. When we take a look at ribs, we have true ribs, we have false ribs, and we have floating ribs. When I look at a true rib is rib number 1 through 7, and basically it comes around and it has a direct attachment with the sternum. So ribs number 1 through 7 are called true ribs because they have direct attachment to the actual sternum itself. When I take a look at false ribs don't have a direct attachment to the sternum. So they come around, then they attach to a piece of cartilage that then kind of goes all the way up to the sternum. So there's not like a direct attachment to the sternum itself with a false rib when we take a look at it. Ribs number 8 through 12 are called false ribs. They don't have direct attachment to the sternum. And specifically, ribs number 11 and 12 are a specific type of false rib called a floating rib that doesn't have any attachment to the sternum whatsoever. So you have true ribs, false ribs, and floating ribs. A lot of times in the NFL, when a quarterback gets sacked or gets hit hard as they're throwing from the side and they fracture a rib, the rib that gets fractured a lot of times is this floating rib. So that finishes the axial skeleton. We're now going to talk a little bit about the appendicular skeleton. The appendicular skeleton consists of your limbs, the pectoral girdle, which is your shoulder girdle, your basically your shoulder capsule, and then your pelvic girdle are the 3 areas that we're going to take a look at when we're looking at the appendicular skeleton. So remember, your appendicular skeleton are your appendages. This is your shoulder girdle or pectoral girdle, and then this is your pelvic girdle that's right here, as well as your appendages is what we're going to look at when we take a look at the appendicular skeleton. We take a look at the pectoral girdle or the shoulder region. Consists of the clavicle. Another name for the clavicle is the collarbone. The clavicle is going to articulate with the sternum, and then it also attaches to the scapula. The scapula is also called your shoulder blade. These bones allow the humerus to have exceptional free movement. So this is the clavicle that's right here, and then this awkward-looking bone back here is what we call your scapula. Again, this is your clavicle. This is your scapula. The humerus is the bone that's also known as your funny bone. It forms your upper limb that we have, so that's your humerus. And then we have the radius and the ulna. Remember, the radius always follows your thumb. The radius is rad. So this is my thumb that's here. My radius is always going to be in line with this thumb when I take a look at it. The ulna follows your pinky, so pinky ulna. So you have your radius, and then you have this is your radius, this is your ulna. Your ulna also forms your elbow. Moving down, we take a look at your wrist. The bones of your wrist are called your carpals. You have 8 carpal bones. The palm of your hand is the bones that are called your metacarpals. Then you have your phalanges, which are your fingers. We take a look at your phalanges. Your thumb is the only finger that's not composed of 3 bones. This is a diagram of your carpals that you have here. These are your metacarpals, and then these are your phalanges up here. We take a look at the pelvic girdle. We're looking at the coxal bone itself. The coxal bone is composed of the fusion of 3 different bones: the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. We take a look at the pelvic girdle. There's 2 coxal bones in the sacrum. The bony pelvis is 2 coxal bones, the sacrum and the coccyx. So when we use the bony pelvis and pelvic girdle, that's what we're referring to, or those bones are what we're referring to. So the pelvic girdle is going to do several things, but it's protecting your reproductive organs, your urinary bladder, and then parts of the large intestine. The weight of the upper body kind of rests in this particular area, so these bones have to be really strong. So taking a look at the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis that's here, this up here is the ilium, okay? So looking at this particular way right here, this is the ilium, this is the ischium that's right here, so this is the ischium that's right here, and then up here is the pubis. So you have your ilium, your ischium, and your pubis. When we look at the 3 bones that fuse together to form your coxal bone. If that didn't work for you guys, this diagram here does a little bit better job of showing you this. But up here, this is what we call our ilium that's right here. So this is our ilium. I'll mark that with an I. This coming down here, right here, this is my ischium. I'll mark this with the IS. And then this bone coming across here is my pubic bone. I'll mark that with a P. So you have your ilium, your ischium, and your pubis. These bones all fuse together to help form your coxal bone when we take a look at it. So those are the three bones that fuse together. Note right here is your sacrum, right here is your coccyx. This is your number one bone, guys, in determining the actual sex of the individual itself. So on your test, you can expect to see a male pelvis and a female pelvis and have to be able to identify which one's male and which one's female and how you go about knowing that. This slide is just explaining some of the gender differences that we have in the pelvis itself. So the female, the inlet's more large and circular. The female pelvis as a whole is shallower. And then we take a look at the pubic angle. The pubic arch is more rounded and it has a greater angle that's associated with it. So when I take a look at the way to tell a male pelvis from a female pelvis here, this is a subpubic angle. This is less than 90 degrees or 90 degrees in a male. In a female, it's greater than 90 degrees when I take a look at that right there. When I take a look at the width of the false pelvis from ilium to ilium, it's wider in a female than that of a male. When I take a look at the pelvic rim, it's a lot more shallower in a male and a lot more wider in a female, so a baby can fit through this particular area itself. So taking a look at the femur next. Femur is the strongest, heaviest bone in the human body. It's also called your thigh bone. This is what your femur looks like. Moving down, guys, we have the tibia and the fibula. Remember, the tibia is called your shin bone. The tibia goes with your big toe. The fibula is very thin. It's kind of a stabilizing bone that sits off to the side. So you have your tibia, big toe, and then your fibula hangs off to the side here. We talked about these malleoluses when we measured the length of our tibia in that height estimation from bone activity. Looking at the foot, we have our tarsals, which are basically our ankles. Then we have our metatarsals, which is the palm of the foot. And then we have our phalanges, which are the toes of our foot itself. So you have your tarsals, your metatarsals, and then you have your phalanges, kind of the same setup as your hand itself. So that kind of wraps up Unit 1.2, looking at the bones themselves. We then used various measurement techniques, protractors, things like that, to be able to measure different things on the actual bones themselves to determine the ethnicity of the individual, the height of the individual, the age of the individual by looking at those particular bones. But a lot of that activity introduced you to the different bones of the human body. We're going to move on now to 1.3. And 1.3, what we did is we analyzed DNA as what we're looking at in Unit 1.3, and we removed the actual DNA from the bones, and we ran them through what we call restriction enzymes in order to figure out who this missing person actually, or who these bones actually belong to by matching them up with an actual missing person themselves. So I'm going to talk a little bit about 1.3 is what I'm going to talk a little bit about now, and the use of restriction enzymes. So then the next thing that we moved into, guys, is we began to talk a little bit about DNA itself. And looking at the effects of restriction enzymes on this DNA that we got from the actual bone. So first thing I take a look at is these things that we call restriction enzymes. So if I take a look at a bacterium, all right, this is kind of a generic diagram of a bacterium that we have here that they give for what a bacterium looks like. You have to remember that a bacterium does not have an immune system, okay, per se. And bacterium get invaded by viruses and things like that, can attack it. So what happens is sometimes a virus may attack. This is a generic diagram of what a virus looks like. This virus may attack and inject DNA or some type of genetic molecule inside of the bacterium. And a bacterium has to have a way to help ward off this viral genetic material. So it has something inside of it that we call restriction enzymes. And what these restriction enzymes do is they basically cut up the DNA into little tiny fragments so no replication can occur of that viral particle within inside the bacterium. So that's kind of where we find these restriction enzymes. We find restriction enzymes inside of bacterium is where we find them. And each restriction enzyme that we find inside of these bacterium can be very specific. So a different bacterium may splice up or cut up DNA at a different fragment point than another restriction enzyme that we find in another bacterium. So we identify different restriction enzymes in different bacterium. So when we take a look at the names of these restriction enzymes, these names of restriction enzymes that we give, they might be called something like Echo R1 or something like that. So like when I take a look at like an enzyme that we call Echo R1 that I see here, the name of that particular enzyme itself, the name of that restriction enzyme itself is the name of the actual bacterium, is what we're giving when we're giving the name of the restriction enzyme. So Echo R1 comes from that particular bacterium itself. So this is an example, guys, of these restriction enzymes at work that you can see here. This is an enzyme called Echo R, restriction enzyme called Echo R1. And you can see, guys, it binding onto the DNA, recognizing a particular site is basically what it's doing. And basically, it's going to cut at those particular sites that you have. Now, when it makes these cuts, some of the time you wind up with these things that we call sticky ends, which is these fragments that don't have another nucleotide pair that go along with it. So these are called sticky ends. When I'm taking a look at the fragment size, I'm counting the actual nucleotides or base pairs that I have with one another. So this fragment here is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, 6 nucleotides long when I actually take a look at it, or 6 base pairs long when I'm taking a look at it. This one's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 base pairs long when I take a look at it. So we do not count these that do not have a pair that go along with them when we're looking at these base pairs. So this one's 6, like I said, when we take a look at it. So if I were then to cut these with these restriction enzymes and then load this particular DNA in gel electrophoresis in our electrophoresis chamber, the smaller the fragment, the further that it's going to go. So basically, when I run it through here, the one that was 6 is going to leave a banding pattern somewhere like right here, and the one that was 7 is going to be up here. So the smaller the fragment, the further that it actually runs on the gel itself when we take a look at banding patterns in gel electrophoresis. But those restriction enzymes are the ones that did the cutting. When you guys took PBS, in PBS, you guys ran gels that were already cut with restriction enzymes. In HBS, you guys exposed the 2 missing people to 2 separate enzymes. Is what you expose them to. And the more restriction enzymes that you expose the DNA to, the greater likelihood that you have a match when trying to identify that particular missing person with the bone itself. So when I take a look at these restriction enzymes in action, there's one called Echo R1. And Echo R1, when it finds the shape of GAATTC, it makes a cut in between the G and the A. Remember, DNA is double-stranded, and it has 2 strands. The top strand runs 5' to 3' this way, so we call this 5' to 3' this way, and then the bottom strand runs 5' to 3' this way. Okay, so it's going to make a cut here, and then it always reads 5' to 3' when the enzyme's reading. So this bottom strand is going to read G, A, T, T, C the opposite way. So it's going to make a cut in between here, and these are the fragments that I'm going to have when I take a look at it. So that's the cut that's going to make with Echo R1. As I move down this activity, it's asking you to cut this particular DNA fragment with Echo R1. Is what we have, and the key to remember is that 5' to 3' thing that I was just talking with you about. So if I take a look at this DNA fragment right here, it's going to make a cut in between the G and the A when it reads GAATTC. So there's going to be a cut here, is the initial one. There's going to be a cut here. The next one that I have is right here, GAATTC. So there's a cut there, and there's a cut there. As I come across here, as I continue to read, I'm looking for GAATTC. There's another one that's right here between the G and the A, right here. and right there's your other cut that you have right there. So these are the major cuts that you have right here, and it's asking you to write the number of restriction fragments, pieces after digestion. So you're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4. You're going to have 4 different fragments is what you're going to have. Then it's asking you to list the size of the fragments in base pairs listed from smallest to largest. Remember, when we list the base pairs, they have to have a match. So when I look at this one here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the first one's going to be 5 base pairs long. The next smallest one's right here. This one's 7 base pairs long. And then the 2 bigger ones that you have are going to be 16 and 17. On your test, I'm going to ask you guys to be able to do a similar problem to this with restriction enzymes. So just remember, restriction enzymes basically cut the DNA when it recognizes a particular sequence of nucleotides is what it's actually going to read when it reads these actual sequences that are there. And you're going to do something very similar on your test to this particular type of question.